Hi, and welcome to the Brookdale Visiting Writers Series. My name is Suzanne Parker, and I'm the director of the Visiting Writers Series here and part of the English faculty. I'm pleased today to be talking to Benjamin Skinner. He is a writer and journalist whose work has appeared in Newsweek International and Foreign Affairs magazine. He is a fellow with the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. His critically acclaimed first book is called A Crime So Monstrous, Face to Face with Modern-Day Slavery, which former President Bill Clinton called rigorously investigated and fearlessly reported. Most recently, Benjamin was awarded the 2009 Nonfiction Daytona Literary Peace Prize for his work. So welcome to the show, Ben.
Thanks. Good to be with you, Suzanne.
I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about how you came to writing this book.
Sure. The genesis, the kindling, if you were, was set generations earlier. I come from a long line of abolitionists, so abolition is really in my blood. My great-great-grandfather fought with Grant's army at the siege of Petersburg. Other relatives were Quakers, who were the original abolitionists, who were railing against the traffic in men body. And I learned all about this around the dinner table and in Quaker meeting growing up.
So this was a living history for you.
It was a living history for me. But I didn't realize that slavery was going on until I picked up a book called Disposable People by Kevin Bales. This was a seminal work for a lot of us that have gotten involved with the anti-slavery struggle. It was, his estimate was that there are 27 million slaves in the world today, and that's a number that's been picked up and adopted by the United Nations, and it's become sort of the axiom for the total estimate of the number of slaves in the world today. That number is staggering. That means that there are more slaves today than at any point in human history. But it doesn't mean anything unless you understand what the slavery of one man, one woman, one child means. And so that's what I set out to do with the book.
So you actually said, I want to go learn the stories of the individual people.
Exactly, and wanted to bring that out and put flesh on the numbers. And what I found was that, well, first of all, let's define the issue, because it's so important. Today, slavery is, in many people's eyes, a metaphor for undue hardship. If you look up in Merriam-Webster dictionary, the first definition is drudgery or toil, and people throw it around to mean all sorts of things. You'll get a banker making a six-figure salary who feels chained to his mortgage, and so he says, you know, I'm a wage slave. Slaves, accurately described, narrowly described, as I use the term, as Kevin Bales uses the term, are those forced to work, held through fraud, under threat of violence, for no pay beyond subsistence. These are people who cannot walk away from their work. And by that mere definition, there are more slaves today than at any point in human history.
And this is the 27 million then?
This is the 27 million, yeah. And the International Labor Office has a more narrow estimate using government statistics, and that begins at 12.3 million. But one way or another, we're talking about more slaves today than at any point in human history.
Do you find that one of the jobs this book has is actually educating people as to what contemporary slavery means? Sure.
My goal was to do two things. One, to tell a story that riveted people, that brought people in to the lives, to the tragedy of slaves' lives, but also to the hope held out by survivors, and to the inspiration held out by survivors. And I found dozens of survivors who had rebuilt their lives and had moved on to, very much in the tradition of Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, had stood up and said, we demand our humanity, and we demand it for our brothers and sisters. And that to me is the whole point of telling the story. Because these are not disposable people. These are people who have the potential to be survivors. Survivors have the potential to be citizens. Citizens have the potential to be leading abolitionists and end slavery once and for all, which is something that I believe we can do in our lifetime.
The book is structured in a way that there's a lot of facts and all the rest of it that you get there, and there's a history. But as you said, you really do focus on individual stories. as you go throughout the book. What were some of the stories that really did stand out for you then?
You know, this is one of these issues that I take very personally now, because it is so personal, because you meet these survivors. The example that I looked at when I was writing this book was Samantha Power's magisterial work on genocide, A Problem from Hell. And I realized when I was in an underground brothel in Bucharest and I was being offered a young woman for sale who had the visible effect of Down syndrome and who had marks all over one of her arms where she had been trying to kill herself, that the difference between the victims that Samantha Power was describing and the victims that I was encountering and describing were that the victims of genocide are obviously no longer with us, they're dead. The victims that I was describing are very much still alive, and as far as I know, some of them are still in hell. And so all of their stories affected me deeply, and that's why as soon as I wrote the book, I had to take off the journalist hat and become an activist on this.
So you're no longer working as a journalist?
Oh, well, no, I put the journalist hat back on.
You swapped them.
There's still too many stories to tell. And I have no trouble maintaining objectivity in any given story. But I think in the face of slavery, which is an abomination, which is a crime against humanity universally recognized in over a dozen conventions, in over a dozen universal conventions, there is no neutrality. I go into this believing that slavery itself is evil, and that the people who are participating in slavery must be stopped. And the frightening thing is that this is not far from where we live. 5 hours from where we are right now, I was able to negotiate in broad daylight the sale of a 12-year-old girl, with the explicit use of this girl being for domestic slavery. In the place where I was negotiating, Port-au-Prince, Haiti, in Haiti, there are, according to UNICEF, up to 300,000 child slaves, domestic child slaves, held in homes, forced to care, forced to cook, forced to clean, forced to do all manner of domestic work. Called restivex, exactly.
Yeah.
Restivex, which is a euphemism. It's a very nice term for a very nasty practice. It means it's a Creole conjunction meaning stay with, and what traffickers, such as the one that I was negotiating with, will do is they will go out and they will talk to parents and they will say, "Mommy, Poppy, I know your child is starving. I know that there are no schools out here in the rural areas. I know that your child is dying of a preventable disease. I can provide school, I can provide food, I can provide medicine, and all that I need in exchange is a little bit of light labor." And so when faced with that option versus watching their children slowly starve, parents make a devil's choice.
Sure.
And they yield their child, they yield their child to the trafficker and an uncertain fate, as opposed to the certain fate of slow starvation or death from a preventable disease.
It's a desperate choice.
And this results in the negotiation that I was having with this individual on the street in broad daylight. I was offered this girl. At a certain point, the trafficker leaned in and said, "This is rather a delicate question, but would you want this child as a partner as well as a domestic?" And my translator made it perfectly clear what he meant by partner. And for the majority of the 300,000 slaves, most of whom are girls, the sexual abuse and rape is part and parcel of their slavery. And the asking price for this child was $100, and within 2 minutes I negotiated the price down to $50.
Which is probably less than your cab fare to the airport.
It would be less than the cab fare to the airport from here. It was staggering. The devaluation of human life in the modern era is pronounced.
Now, I know because you opened the book actually with that story, which you got to the point where you had to make a decision as a journalist, what were you going to do? Would you actually purchase this girl and set her free? That must have been a dilemma.
It is. It was, and as I continue to do the work in this field, it remains a dilemma. I was in South Africa for Time magazine this summer, and within a 5-block radius of one of the World Cup stadiums, I was investigating a Nigerian human trafficking network that was selling 15-year-old girls, or younger in some cases, on the street for sex after they'd purchased them from recruiters. I began one night at the bedside of a 17-year-old who had full-blown AIDS, who had tuberculosis, who was 3 months pregnant, and a week after I interviewed her, she was dying alone. She asked me to take care of her body, and a week after I interviewed her, she did die alone. And later on that night, I found the person, her best friend, who had been sold with her, and she was put on the street. And she was 15 years old, and I asked her 3 questions. How old are you? 15. Where are you from? Eastern Cape. Do you need help? And she said yes, desperately. So it was a very convoluted process, and I write about it in the story. So I'd encourage your viewers to pick up the issue.
Which issue is this?
This is coming out. It should be around New Year's in Time magazine. We wound up getting that girl out. We didn't pay for her emancipation. And this is a critical thing. I talked to organizations, shelters, people that work to free slaves and keep them free. And over again, I was told the same thing. Do not pay for human life. You'll be giving rise to a trade in human misery. You will be monetizing a trade in many cases that is a bartered arrangement. And you will be incentivizing a crime against humanity. But what I did do in this instance and in other instances was I went in, got the girl out through confronting the traffickers, and then made sure to follow up, because emancipation does not end with liberation. And in this country, we fought a civil war which freed between 3 and 4 million new Americans. And yet we dump them on an economy with no access to credit, with certainly no reparations, with very little training for how to deal and how to steer their way through the new economy.
Support at all.
And 150 years later, we're paying the price for that botched emancipation. In this one instance, with this one little girl, I didn't want to do that.
Well, I mean,
and so I found a sponsor, and I'm happy to say that now she's in school. She's being cared for by a social worker who is very actively monitoring her situation, because I'm very actively monitoring the social worker. The case against the trafficker is under investigation using my tapes, and
that's wonderful.
And she's HIV negative.
Oh, fantastic. Fantastic. And this is all in Time magazine.
And this is
upcoming New Year's edition.
Exactly.
Well, we're going to take a short break. I'm talking to E. Benjamin Skinner, and he was just telling us about an article he's got coming up in Time magazine. Please join us after the break.
Hey, staggering.
Ready?
Yes. You looking good? Great hit.
The odds of a child becoming a professional athlete are 1 in 16,000. The odds of a child being diagnosed with autism? 1 in 166. The odds say it's time to listen. To learn the signs of autism, visit autismspeaks.org.
Once they've outgrown their toddler seat, they're still not ready for adult safety belts alone. 4'9" is the magic number. Until then, kids need a booster seat. Make sure your little pumpkin gets there safely. Visit boosterseat.gov.
Here are the low monthly payments and interest rate as we promised. Here's where they triple. The rest of this is really just here so that we get your house when you can't pay us back.
Predatory lenders are never this easy to spot. Call us and protect yourself with the facts.
Hi, and welcome back to the Brookdale Visiting Writers Series show. My name is Suzanne Parker, and I'm talking with E. Benjamin Skinner, the author of A Crime So Monstrous, Face to Face with Modern-Day Slavery. So, welcome back.
Thanks.
I was wondering, it seems like, you're talking about slaves who are transported across borders, slaves who are in all these different countries in the book. And I wonder, this seems to be an international problem, how the international community, the UN and the like, is dealing with this. Aren't they looking at governments saying, deal with this problem?
Well, one would hope, given that nearly every country in the world adheres to at least the International Labor Office prohibition on forced labor, 1930. Something like 90 countries adhere to the Palermo Protocol on human trafficking. The problem is the UN has refused to call slavery in most instances because it would engender a robust response, and this is something that the Security Council, which would take the lead on this, which involves such human rights avatars as China and Russia, they don't particularly want to take this on. So, very much to its credit, the American government and the U.S. State Department pressed into service, as it were, by the Congress, which passed a law at the end of the Clinton administration, has taken on the role of sort of global monitor of human trafficking and modern-day slavery. There's an office within the State Department called the Office to Monitor and Combat Human Trafficking and Modern-Day Slavery. It's a tiny office. On average, their budget is each year is about $17 million. To put that in context, if you take the entire budget for that office, the entire budget of all of the federal programs to combat the traffic in human beings, we are talking about as much, in the last 9 years since that law was passed, we are talking about as much money being spent to fight the traffic in human beings in the last 9 years as is spent in 3 days to fight the traffic in illegal drugs. And this is not to diminish the relative horrors of pot smoking, but it is to say, which is the more monstrous crime?
Sure.
Is it a 15-year-old selling pot on the street, or is it a 15-year-old being sold on the street?
Did the Bush administration, I may be getting this wrong, but didn't President Bush make a couple of speeches where he was focusing particularly on sex slavery?
He did, and this is very much to his credit, and I give him credit in the book, that he brought the issue in front of the United Nations, in front of the General Assembly, in a soaring speech penned by Michael Gerson, his chief speechwriter at the time. The problem with the speech was twofold. One, 2/3 of the speech was to do with Iraq. This was September of 2003, and guess which part the media reported on. In fact, a lot of media outlets cut away after that first 2/3. The last third was about human trafficking. And then the second problem was it was so narrowly focused on one form of slavery that it left viewers and the General Assembly with the impression that this was the only form of slavery that the U.S. government cared about, which was sex trafficking. Now, I need to be clear on this. Sex trafficking takes up an enormous amount of the media bandwidth, and during the Bush administration, it took up an enormous amount of the resources. But according to the International Labor Office, their study, which is the best we have of forced labor worldwide, indicates that 17 out of every 18 slaves in the world are held in some form of bondage other than forced commercial sex. We're talking about, now, forced prostitution is monstrous, but it is not the only form of slavery in the world today. And to place the abolition of one slave, of one type of slave, before the abolition of another type of slave, simply by virtue of this person's enslaved in a brothel, this person's enslaved in a quarry, is to put our nation on the wrong side of history.
Mm-hmm. Well, could you talk a little bit about the different ways you can find people who are in slavery? I know you traveled a great deal for the book. You were in India and various different locations. Can you because you talked about debt bondage as well.
Yeah.
And I think, we're rolling into a holiday season, and I think most people hear the word debt and they think what they just charged
Right.
up, on their credit cards at the mall.
Right.
What do you mean exactly by that? How else can people kind of end up in slavery?
I'm so glad you brought that up, because the vast majority of slaves in the world today are held in this form of debt bondage, which, the official UN designation is hereditary collateralized debt bondage, which is a classic sanitized euphemism for a monstrous form of slavery, which essentially means that whole villages, in some cases, are enslaved for generations. I've talked to one fellow who I profile actively in the book, who was enslaved in a quarry. He and his entire family were required to take rocks out of the earth, to break those rocks down using very primitive pikes and mortars into gravel for the subgrade of India's roads, and then to further pulverize that gravel into sand, into silica sand, which is a key element in glass. And there's only one way that you can turn a profit off of handmade sand, and that is through slavery. And the person that enslaved this fellow and his entire family and that entire village was one of the most powerful people, who acted with total impunity and sheer violence. He was known by local officials to have killed 5 high caste Indians, Brahmins. These weren't slaves. These were other contractors. He was known by the slaves to have killed over a dozen, and they're slaves. And their deaths didn't even register on the police ledgers. This man was a serial killer, and he had never once been brought into the dock.
Wow. No. I wonder because we talked about the Bush administration a little bit, and that there are these different forms of slavery. I know in the Huffington Post last year, you were somewhat critical of the Obama administration's sort of unwillingness to confront this issue. And then since then, he has, I think it's Lou DeBaca, am I saying that? Appointed him as sort of the anti-slavery czar. Do you see this as forward momentum?
Sure. To be clear, of course, last year we were still the Bush administration, and I was concerned that I hadn't heard anything forceful from candidate Obama declaring that human trafficking would be a top priority. In fact, shortly after I wrote that, he came out at Saddleback Church and said explicitly, the abolition of modern-day slavery has got to be a top priority for my administration. Now, here's the thing. It's not who in Washington says that they're against slavery. It's how high up in their inbox it is. And he has made terrific appointments, which is a great start. He's got Ambassador DeBaca in place, who is one of the nation's most decorated federal prosecutors, who is responsible for the convictions of over 100 traffickers within U.S. borders and the freedom and rehabilitation of over 600 victims. He has Secretary Clinton, who encountered sex slaves, HIV-positive sex slaves in Southeast Asia as early as 1994, way before this was on almost anybody else's radar screen in policy circles. So he's made the right policy choices, but I come back to this funding issue, and it's so critical. We spend, to give you another staggering statistic, we spend 6% of the total budget for the Fish and Wildlife Commission on slavery. This is a staggeringly underfunded fight.
And no money, then no power.
And this is this is not to say that throwing money at the problem will have an effect, but when you're talking about a business worldwide that reaps profit, if we're talking, and if we're talking about slavery and supply chains of goods that we buy, if we're talking about debt bondage, if we're talking about sex trafficking, if we're talking about the benefits to organized crime, which now human trafficking is the number 2 most lucrative commodity. Human beings are the number 2 most lucrative commodity for organized crime behind drugs. We're talking about at least a $35 billion a year industry, and we're fighting that with a $17 million a year budget.
Wow.
Do the math. We're going to lose if that's the way we're funding it.
Well, we've got a couple minutes left on the show, so I'd just actually like to ask you about people watching who are thinking, wow, what can I do? Is there something, some place I should go, something I can do? What would you recommend?
Great. 3 things very quickly. First of all, get aware, understand the issue. Pick up Kevin Bale's magisterial book, Disposable People, his follow-up, Ending Slavery, which has great tools for fighting the trade. Also pick up my book, of course,
Crime So Monstrous.
Crime So Monstrous.
Which I'd like to say also as well has in the back an epilogue that talks about afterward with resources.
Absolutely.
And all the rest.
The paperback has been updated, so if you have the hardcover, buy the paperback, buy the Kindle edition, go the whole hog. And a quarter of my royalties are going to Free the Slaves, which is the oldest organization, which is the second way of getting involved. It's the oldest human rights organization in the world, the American wing of the oldest human rights organization in the world, which is Anti-Slavery International. They have the best programs that I've seen that comprehensively do abolition right. They go and they find where slaves are, they get them out, and then they keep them out by ensuring that slaves themselves own their freedom and become independent. So, and they're on the web at, you can link, I link to them on my website at crimesomonstrous.com.
Great.
And then finally, keep the pressure on public officials. If the senators from New Jersey have not stated that this is, they're not part of the human trafficking caucus, they should be. If they're not supporting the Baucus-Grassley legislation on revealing slavery and forced labor and child labor in supply chains, they should be sponsors of this. This is an incredibly important issue, and in a democracy, we have to hold our public officials accountable.
Well, that sounds wonderful. So get educated, give money, and hold our public officials accountable.
Absolutely.
On those 3 suggestions, it has been a pleasure having you on the show.
Thank you.
And we've been talking to E. Benjamin Skinner, the author of A Crime So Monstrous. Thanks for joining us, and do watch again.